If you want an anime version of Darkest Dungeon, then this is likely your best bet. But aside from the aesthetic, it's looking like Mistover does enough things unique to itself to make it worth looking into for those who want something a little different. I don't know if it'll have the same longevity as Darkest Dungeon, however it does have better pacing in my opinion, as well as the usual multiple difficulties to select and several dungeons to explore. So there should be enough here for those who want to get into it. I haven't gotten nearly as deep into this game as I would like to, but I think I've seen enough to have a basic idea of what it entails. Mistover begins with a rather lengthy opening, talking about how the end of the world is nigh and everyone's trying to enter this tornado or something, where all the problems are coming from. There's plenty of voice acting, although it's all in Japanese, so that doesn't do a whole lot for me. The English translation and grammar is good, thankfully, so no complaints there. But there is a lot of reading to go through. Most of it is very front-loaded, but the game does keep up the story throughout. I mean, I don't really care for any of these characters and the story isn't all that interesting, so initially this is a bit of a slog to get through. But maybe it gets better later on. The gameplay revolves around hiring a party of 5 adventurers and exploring a grid-based map, searching for treasures, avoiding traps, and killing monsters. That sort of thing. Similar to Darkest Dungeon, the two main things to keep an eye on are the team's hunger and the brightness of their lamp. As long as your team has a full belly, then they will regenerate their health and execute special abilities out on the field, while maintaining a high luminosity reveals more of the map with each step and makes it easier to avoid traps. Unfortunately, it's a little unbalanced. You can get by with low light, and in my experience, it doesn't even affect battles that much. On top of that, there are light flowers all over the place that can be reused for free and restore a ton of light. So really, light isn't a big issue here. Food, on the other hand, can be an absolute killer. There is no way to heal outside of battles, aside from using items, so you're reliant on the automatic regeneration. And using special abilities can drain your hunger very quickly. If you're not careful, you can find your team starving to death before long. Which leads to one of my biggest complaints about this game. It doesn't tell you a lot of the little details. There are a bunch of tutorials with pictures and whatnot, sure, but it's very misleading in other ways. It gives pretty equal importance to food and seeds, with the seeds being used to fuel the lamp. But the latter is not that big of a deal at all. Bandages and the bleeding mechanic is also not given a good enough explanation either. Sometimes a character can bleed for almost no damage, while other times it can be a serious threat. Bandages are very important to have on hand just in case, but you'll never know how badly without trial and error. And that's how much of the game is like. It puts an emphasis on using the Paladin's Destroy Obstacles ability, but without advising that it can use up a lot of hunger. And it'll sometimes be cheaper to destroy obstacles normally, which deals damage to the whole team, but that's fine because they'll regenerate it anyway. Perhaps worst of all is buying a bunch of expensive meat, only to find it disappear upon finishing a dungeon. What's actually happening is that any consumables taken out of a dungeon becomes polluted, and has a severely reduced effectiveness. But the game never tells you that, except in this tiny message that's easy to miss. The combat is, like much of the game, a unique twist on Darkest Dungeon style. Instead of parties being in a row of 4 slots, they are instead placed on a 3x3 grid. However, similar rules still apply. Certain attacks can only be used when a party member is either in the front or the back row, and it'll only work when an enemy is either in the front or the back row as well. The middle of a row allows for execution of anything at all, so it's a popular place to be in. However, there are often attacks, either executed or received, that will move the player to another space. So it's important to have options available for multiple situations, such as the Paladin who likes to be in the front row, but if an attack pushes her back, then she has the option to do a powerful counterattack, which also moves her up a space, at the cost of MP. Like any good RPG, various characters have different strengths and weaknesses. Once again with the Paladin, she has excellent provoke and defensive abilities to draw the enemy's attention, while the Sister is able to heal her allies effectively, and the Witch has powerful long-ranged attacks. What really interests me, however, are the more unique characters. For example, the Shadowblade has several attacks that apply upon her the Collect Power buff, which stays active for a few turns and powers up one of her strongest attacks, Release Power. Furthermore, Release Power will move the Shadowblade back a space, while Sting Hard will then move her forward a space, which also grants her with the Collect Power ability for her to then use Release Power and go back a space again and rinse and repeat as long as your MP is maintained. It's really cool how several attacks play off of each other in this way. Furthermore, while most characters have a typical MP bar, a couple of them, the Ronin and the Grim Reaper, have different ways of going about it. In the Ronin's case, for example, he's awarded points for landing attacks and gains a full meter upon landing a kill, so it's usually a good idea to leave the weaker enemies to him. All of the characters in this game are great, yet it doesn't really feel like there's enough of them. While the Ronin and the Werewolf do have provoke-style abilities, the Paladin has the best one by far. And since the Sister is the only one with decent healing in the game, it pretty much guarantees that she's gonna be the one in your party every single time. Each individual character is really good, but with only 8 of them available, I do wish that there were just a few more to help mix up the team composition. There is a fair bit of customization in the different abilities that can be unlocked, however acquiring new abilities is highly random, and you kind of just have to hope that things work out in your favor. Upon a character's health emptying out, they don't die immediately. Just like in Darkest Dungeon, they're instead transitioned into a state of limbo. At this point, one more hit of any damage will kill them and they'll need to be healed before that happens. If a character is killed, then they're immediately removed from the entire game. All level ups, abilities, and general progress on that character be damned. If the player can win the battle and successfully leave the dungeon, then they'll at least keep the equipment. But having to start over on building up a new character can be a real drag, especially with the Doomsday Clock counting down. The way this works is that if progress through a dungeon was unsatisfactory, then the clock will count down. And if progress was extremely well done, then the player will actually gain time. Progress through a dungeon is tracked by how many monsters were killed, how many treasure chests were opened, and other little variables. So it forces the player to take risks and explore deeply if they don't want the Doomsday Clock to count down. If the clock eventually does hit midnight, then it results in an absolute game over, and the entire game needs to be restarted. The craziest thing is that this applies to some pretty nutty conditions as well, such as entering a lower level dungeon with a party that is over leveled. So you can't easily build up time or anything like that, you have to constantly be taking risks. And good luck trying to save scum. Even if you straight up shut down the game application in the middle of a battle, it'll pick up right there again as if nothing happened. The most difficult thing about this game by far is the uncertainty. In one playthrough, I upgraded my team's hunger and luminosity early on, which was a pretty big help, while another took twice as many dungeon runs for the same upgrade. One playthrough awarded me with tons of gear and supplies, while another had me scrounging and barely making it very far. Although, unlike Darkest Dungeon, your characters don't have vices that stop them from performing well, such as having to spend some time drinking at the bar or getting treated at an asylum before they can participate again. There are things called jinxes in Mistover that cause a character to be at an advantage or disadvantage in certain situations, but they hardly prevent the character from being used at all, which is nice for keeping up the pace of the game so the player doesn't need to have multiple copies of the same character and keep a practical army of characters all evenly leveled. That being said, it might not necessarily be a bad idea to do so, just for the sake of having slightly less risky runs in lower level dungeons to tone down the Doomsday Clock a little. It's all about learning the intricacies to make the game easier little by little in subsequent playthroughs, like which enemies to focus on and which attacks are worth upgrading. You start to learn how much food is worth buying and which recruits to spend money on. It's just too bad that, when you get down to it, So much of the game is trial and error, and if you mess up too many times, then it's all over. But that's also a big part of what makes it pretty exciting and why I keep wanting to play some more. Specific upgrades, like the maximum amount of items that you're allowed to carry, as well as experience point and money multipliers, all stay permanent. So as long as you can keep the doomsday clock from hitting midnight, then you should be able to make progress one step at a time. It's also a lot faster once you get used to it. The menus and navigating the dungeons are really clunky at first, and a single dungeon would easily take me an hour to get through. But now I'm able to get through them in about 30 minutes. I don't want to give this game too high of a score because I don't want to give people the wrong impression. I'm sure that most people will get frustrated early on and give up. But if you've played Darkest Dungeon to your heart's content, and you want something that's a little different, or you're otherwise willing to put up with a brutally unforgiving game that's going to take a few runs to get the hang of, then I think you'll find something really special here. Thanks for watching my review on Mistover. I don't typically like to make reviews until I feel like I've completed a game, but I think this one's going to take a long time to do so, and I wanted to put this out there now because I feel like this game is really interesting. I'm planning to get through this game eventually, so I might make another video about this once that time comes.